So even a sustainable utilization of some species are scientifically possible. And from compliance point of view, we do have a lot of different modern tools to detect any smuggling or illegal catch. Still, they like to deny all the utilization of whales because whales now regarded as a very charismatic animal.
Welcome to the Case for Conservation podcast, where we explore biodiversity conservation and the environment more broadly and interrogate conventional wisdom for the sake of a more robust case for conservation. I'm your host, Andre Mado. There are few environmental issues more emotive than the hunting of whales. Although the focus of environmentalists has shifted to other topics in recent times, whaling remains contentious whenever it's brought up. This is understandable considering that for the first half of the 20th century and into the 1970s, several whale species were hunted to near extinction. But as crude oil took over from whale oil as the fuel of industry, whale populations began making impressive recoveries. Nevertheless, a handful of countries and populations continue to hunt them, much to the chagrin of the rest of the world. Perhaps the most high-profile whaling country is Japan. To add to the saga, in 2019, Japan ended about 7 decades of membership of the International Whaling Commission, IWC, due to unresolvable differences. The IWC is the global body responsible for the management of whaling and conservation of whales. There are countless sources providing the anti-whaling point of view, to some of which I've provided links in the podcast description. So for balance, please refer to these resources. But comprehensive accounts of the other side of the story are less easy to find. Joji Morishita has been, among many things, Japan's commissioner to the IWC and the chair of the commission. And I doubt that there's any better person in the world to tell Japan's side of the whaling story. In this fascinating discussion, he explains why Japan withdrew from the IWC, and he responds to many of the core critiques of whaling. I began by asking Joji about the conservation case against whaling.
I think general understanding or general misunderstanding of the public about whaling issue is this is an issue of endangered species, and some countries are hunting for endangered species. In that sense, it's a conservation issue as well as an environmental issue. And also, whales are treated as a symbol of environmental protection in many places, with some reason. However, the whaling issue has been going through many transitions and changes and the recent developments. And as long as pure conservation issue, in other words, biological sustainability of utilizing some limited number of whales is concerned, there are almost no conservation issue. And let me explain a little bit more detail. When you think about the whaling issue, sometimes people think about the Save the Whale campaign or Save the Whale slogan. And the implication is all the whales or the whale is endangered. But biologically speaking, there are at least 88 or 89 different species of whales or cetaceans. And some of them, yes, are pretty much depleted or the population is very small, either as a result of a past overharvesting and either from originally they are from a very small number and because of environmental degradation in their habitats. But also there are many species that has either recovered from the past overharvesting or some of the species like minke whale, which has never been overharvested in the past. One of the reasons is they produce a very small amount of oil so that they were not hunted for the oils, which was a major industry in the 60s and before. So talking about the whale or save the whale, almost like saying like the birds are endangered, but there are many different species of birds. So when we are talking about real conservation science, you have to look at whales as a species level or sometimes stocks level. Some of the species are already abundant or either recovered, others are not. And whaling countries, Japan, Norway, Iceland, and sometimes others, now we are only like to utilize abundant species on a sustainable manner. And what does that mean? We have a pretty good idea for some species, which are studied very well, about their population size and their reproductive rates. Still, those who are opposed to whaling are very precautious about the utilization of animals, say you cannot know exact number of whales, or you cannot estimate the reproductive rate so accurately. So there could be some mistakes. Maybe unintentionally, you might be over-harvesting and leading that population to a depletion or even extinction. And also they say you have a climate change, your scientific data from the beginning might be wrong, or whalers could cheat about the reporting of their catch so that you cannot get accurate scientific assessment of the population status. Let me provide some answers. For example, the estimation of a stock size or population size, there are established way of surveys or sighting surveys approved by the Scientific Committee of International Whaling Commission. And this is actually based on the theory to guess the number of submarines underwater during wartime. And based on this similar theory, now we can guess the number of whales. And this guess is also important. It sounds like I'm saying it's not accurate, but the number we can get for the population size of whales is actually underestimated. Because the current theory is essentially trying to guess the number that at least there.
Right. And that I think that's the same with animal populations in general, that estimates tend to be
Yeah,
conservative.
exactly. And it's by system as well as by intention. And the system means the way of a survey is always incomplete in many sense. So as a result, numbers we see could be just underestimate. And by intention, scientists try to be, if you could be wrong, you like to be wrong on the safety side. So the precautionarity is included in the theory itself.
And I would imagine that also the methods for estimating numbers continue to improve, right? The accuracy continues to increase over time.
Yes, the IWC Scientific Committee requires the continuous survey of estimation of a population, and that is in usual case submitted by the scientists of Japan, Norway, Iceland, and that's subject to scrutiny and reconfirmation by scientists from other countries. Incidentally, currently the Scientific Committee of IWC has usual attending members of more than 200 scientists around the world. So you can at least say that this is one of the most reliable scientific assessment you can get through our international system. And also we just talked about the estimate for population, the capital money in your bank account. Also, we can get from many different sources, like the rate of a pregnancy or survival rate of young animals, and also the sighting. When you do a sighting, you can see either it's adult or juvenile, so you can guess the portion of young animals. And if you can continue this every year, you can see some trend. And based on that data, we can have some range of reproduction rate. And typically, for the large whales, the baleen whales in general, it's between 2 to 4, 5%. And in case of a scientific committee of IWC, they use the most precautionary, start from precautionary number and give other options for the simulations. We even see some real observed increasing rate, especially these days, the humpback whales, which is recovering very quickly in southern hemisphere. They sometimes show the increasing rate or interest rate of 10% per year. This is significant. And if this continues 10 years or so, it's almost double. So again, I will not say that we do have a very accurate pinpoint estimate of a population or rate of increase. We do have a conservative estimation, and all the calculations for your catch quarter or catch level is based on this precautionary number. So as long as science is concerned, sustainability is not the problem, or it's ever improving. And when we compare this with conservation of like tunas and other fish stocks, the whales are in much better scientific hands in that sense. Yeah.
Okay. Actually, that's an interesting segue to a follow-up question that I wanted to ask, which was, I guess this is not a realistic scenario, but I take your point that the populations seem to be sustainable at the current levels of harvest. But then on the other hand, there are only three countries that are harvesting at the national level, and then the cumulative contribution of Aboriginal whaling is roughly the same order of magnitude at least. So overall, not a lot of countries or people are harvesting whales. But then what if a whole bunch of other countries decided that they were going to do the
Sure.
same
Yes.
thing?
As long as we know, again, as long as we know, or as long as the International Whaling Commission knows, the whaling activities outside the International Whaling Commission is almost now non-existent or quite limited. And we know some instances where whales are harvested up to several years ago in Philippines, and in Indonesia still continues. But it is not easy to hide extensive whaling activities from the world because catching that big animal in the sea requires substantial activities. However, I do not deny that there could be small-scale catch of whales still, and the IWC, International Whaling Commission, is always trying to collect as much information, both scientific and anecdotal, about the catch of whales outside the International Whaling Commission. That's one point. Another one is Japan is actually arguing that the International Whaling Commission should manage global whaling activities. So we are happy to be managed, and we like to see any non-IWC members that might be whaling outside of IWC to join IWC. However, the current controversy in IWC is preventing that happen. At least the majority of IWC members now see whales as a special animals that should not be harvested under any circumstances. So even a sustainable utilization of some species are scientifically possible. And from compliance point of view, we do have a lot of different modern tools to detect any smuggling or illegal catch. Still, they like to deny all the utilization of whales because whales now regarded as a very charismatic animal. As a result, IWC essentially denies the management of whaling activities. So it is very difficult for us to be managed by this organization or to encourage non-members to join this organization to be managed. So the discussion is now becoming either you conduct whaling or not. It's not how to manage the whaling activities, which is in some countries continuing or even inevitable on a sustainable manner in a global scale or international framework. And the discussion, the controversy surrounding whales and whaling is actually preventing this to happen.
Okay. Yeah, I think we should get back to IWC. In fact, I've got a couple of questions related to that, but maybe just before we get there, I guess that the other, and you alluded to this already, actually, this idea of whales as a charismatic animal, right? As far as animal rights concerns are concerned, I would agree that anyone who's a non-vegan is being hypocritical if they condemn whaling because, they don't have any qualms about harvesting other mammals, except for two things, and these are really just my own thoughts, I guess. One is that whales are generally regarded as being quite highly evolved mammals, and there are other mammals that human beings harvest which are maybe equally highly evolved, but they are highly evolved mammals. And then along with that and related to that is this whole issue of the harvesting process itself and the fact that, especially because whales are so big, it's difficult to kill them in a humane way. So, compared with cattle, for example, although a separate issue there is that the way the cattle are raised is obviously a issue, but the actual killing process is quite quick. Whereas with whales, as far as I understand, it can take minutes and sometimes even hours for a whale to die when harvested.
Yeah. First of all, about the animal rights movement. Actually, I'm not as uh, denying the animal rights group as you just said. Even an inconsistent animal rights argument is sometimes understandable, but the understanding and acceptance might be a different thing. It's free for you or me has a different feeling about different animals. That's fine, and that's a human nature. But imposing that on others, believing that your belief should be accepted by others, that's a different issue. So I'm not denying animal rights, but we need to have some mutual respect and understanding as long as it's sustainable in a wider sense. As to the argument that high intelligence animals or highly evolved animals or animals with some certain degree of emotional capacity should be protected, yes, that is also, we can feel the sympathy to that idea. But the challenge is, what is a high intelligence? We seem to be imposing our way of intelligence to others. We like dogs because they can show a high degree of intelligence. They can play tricks and they can understand what we are thinking about. They can even understand some of the language communications. Seems to be, at least we feel that every day. But that's a human nature. How about honeybees? They don't speak. They don't understand us. They behave very differently. But they have a society, as you know very well, queens and workers and the fighters and finders, and they find the flowers and they come back to the nest and communicate the distance and the direction of that flower to others by dancing. Can we do this? Can human do this? No. This is totally different intelligence. Which is better? If we are saying intelligent animals should be protected, we are imposing our way of intelligence or understanding intelligence to others. You might think this is just a logical, very shallow argument, the argument for the sake of argument. But this could be also presenting an idea or presenting the issue of then where can you draw a line when you separate intelligent animal and non-intelligent animal? And some people see some implications to the treatment of us humans. Intelligent humans are better than non-intelligent humans? What does that mean? So all animals are intelligent in their own way. That's why they are surviving now and living with us in this nature. So again, probably this indicates that we might be just imposing our own way to other animals or to other people as to the meaning of emotion, sympathy, intelligence, all those human nature criteria to see them as our friends or not. Are we doing the same to other human people, colleagues? So some people can see this parallel issue in the argument of whales and other animals. And oftentimes they see this happening in the human conflict situation. The lives of some people in some country has been treated lighter than others. So I'm not denying, again, that animals we feel intelligent and emotional and we like to protect. But can you impose your understanding to others? And as to your second question of you can never kill that big animal in a humane manner. Interestingly, for example, in case of Norwegian whaling, minke whales mainly, 80%, 80% of animals are killed instantaneously. And even in the Antarctic Ocean, when Japan was conducting scientific whaling activities, the ocean is much more rough than the Norwegian water. Still, somewhere between 40 to 50% of animals were killed instantaneously. And the rest was used so-called secondary method. So the second harpoon or the large caliber rifles so that they can be dispatched more humanely. And still, yes, in some cases, some animals continue to live a much longer time, unfortunately. This is, in that sense, common to many hunting activities. And those who are arguing against this cruelty argument in IWC, like Norway and Japan, always says, look at deer hunting or kangaroo hunting, those hunting activities widespread in other countries. Actually, those instantaneous death rate is much lower. And oftentimes they never find the animals they injured. And in addition, oftentimes deer hunting is one of the entertainment. It's like a fishing in some countries. So if you are blaming the whaling activities as to its cruelty or hunting, there should be some consistency. Those who are whaling or hunting as their occupancy or job, they treat animals or respect animals as much as possible. And even they do not have that degree of a sympathy to animal from purely professional aspect, the instantaneous dispatching is much more efficient than taking a long time to dispatch the animal. And also, you have to recognize this is a hunting of a wild animal, which is very different from the processing of cows and pigs in a slaughterhouse, which is conducted under a controlled environment. But the science for making hunting activities, including whaling, more humane has been continuing, and the whaling countries has been providing those data to the scientific committee. But unfortunately, in the most recent IWC discussions, sometimes data submitted by whaling countries are used only to blame and deny the whaling activities. Like you just referred, those worst cases are used to argue against whaling rather than try to improve the hunting activities based on the science. So again, that's unfortunate. And this also is another area that you like to have more of managed activities through the science and the consideration or improvement of a method for hunting rather than deny all the hunting or claim that all the hunting is unregulated and cruel. Both of them is just extreme.
One thing that might be worth just adding into this bit of the discussion is that I think a lot of people don't realize how rough nature is by itself, without the intervention of human beings. And, all animals die eventually. And I just remember one documentary about, I think it was gray whales being attacked by killer whales, by orcas. So there was a mother and a calf, and the mother was trying to protect the calf, but for hours these killer whales, physically hassled this calf until it was dead, and it took several hours. So I think that people are sometimes under the illusion that in nature animals die a peaceful death, but I think that's very seldom the case. So I think that's relevant to the whaling discussion, but also I think any discussion about harvesting wild animals.
Yeah. Another interesting story is that シャチのお弁当. It's like a lunchbox, a box lunch of killer whales. And oftentimes we observe the situation that part of killer whales is surrounding one whale, either mink or a juvenile gray whale, whatever. And they keep them among their pod until they become hungry. They are just bringing their food within their pod. Yeah, they are intelligent enough to do this. Also, your story or your question, idealization of nature, or to see nature as a friendly environment to humans and animals. This is partly related to the concept of a charismatic megafauna issue too. When we talk about megafauna, it's a big cats, wolf, elephants, and whales, sometimes shark. And you think it's a common view or widely shared concept. But when you ask kids, there is a published study. When you ask a kid in the UK, they love big cats, they love the whales and elephants. But when you ask the school kids in Tanzania, they fear that. It's a fierce beast that could kill you or your parents. So depending on your surrounding environment you are living in, animals could be very differently interpreted. When you're living in the UK or even Japan or US and looking at National Geographic and see the Disney movies, all those charismatic animals looks like magnificent. They are magnificent animals, but animals. And sometimes in the national parks, people tend to think the bear is a friendly animal and eventually, unfortunately, killed by those animals. That happens. And in the ocean too, killed by dolphins. Human beings are sometimes killed or injured by dolphins. So even the IWC is looking at the possible regulation of a swim with dolphin programs, whale watching. One of the purposes is not to harass or interfere with dolphins or whales, but others is to keep the safety of human beings. They are big wild animals. And even if they do not have an intention of injuring people, just a slight touch by big animals could break your bone.
Yeah. So moving on from the animal rights side of things, are there any other reasons why there is such a strong anti-whaling lobby? And here in particular, I'm wondering how much politics comes into the discussion. So putting conservation and animal rights aside, I mean, does that cover everything, or are there unrelated political issues that come into the anti-whaling argument as well?
I think the sort of success of anti-whaling activities or campaigns has a very, I think, interesting aspects. Many of the researchers, especially in the whaling countries, pointed out that anti-whaling activities or anti-whaling campaign started all of a sudden at the 1972, the UN Convention of a Human Environment. 1972 is the ending part of the Vietnam War. And there was some movement before this meeting, which was held in Stockholm, that US military activities, they try to destroy all the forests with PCB-related chemicals so that they can chase out the Viet Congs. So that's a huge environmental destruction. So some of the environmental groups try to take up this issue at this meeting in Stockholm in 72. Already US was losing in 72. The Vietnam War ended in April 74, if I remember correctly. So they tried to stop this motion come out at the meeting. And they tried to look for some more interesting issues to discuss at the environmental UN meetings. And somehow the whaling issue was picked up. And the whaling issue has many attractions politically, because many of our countries are, even in 72, has already given up whaling activities. Some of the whale species are prohibited for hunting in the 60s.
Because whale oil was no longer a useful commodity.
That's a big reason. And the crude oil was replacing the need for the whale oils in many countries. So as just industrial activity, it doesn't make sense already at that time. And of course, as a result of a very extensive hunting of whales for oil, mainly, as long as number is concerned, the UK and US, those industrialized countries needed oil at that time. And those are replaced by the crude oil. So economically, anti-whaling activities will not have any negative impact on the industries of those countries. Those who are still continuing whaling is the whaling countries who also use whale as a food, like Norway, Japan, Iceland, and Russia or Soviet Union at the time. So economically, it's more viable for them to continue the whaling because they use all the part of whales, and the number of those countries are quite limited. So it's easy target in that sense, or target that has less negative impact on many of the countries, so that you will not face strong oppositions. This is one of the reasons. And the 72 was this Stockholm meeting, and the IWC adopted the moratorium in 82, so 10 years later. So during that 10 years, the anti-whaling activities were so successful. Many of the anti-whaling organizations expanded their membership, also contributions, their financial gains. I'm sure that many of the members purely wanted to protect whales. As an organization, it became very successful as a business formula. Interestingly, these days, Japan withdrew from the International Whaling Commission, and whaling is not as visible or controversial as before because of climate change, COVID-19, Ukraine. So many of our NGOs who are active in whaling or anti-whaling activities now went out from the business, so they shifted their main target to more lucrative targets. Again, I do respect and believe that many of those who are supporting those organizations, contributing a small amount of money out of your pocket, purely like to protect your environment. But when organizations become very big, like some of the NGOs who has branches everywhere, thousands of people in the organization, and owns a huge number of vessels for your campaign, you just cannot stop that activity overnight if you say that, well, very small number of whales can be harvested in a sustainable manner, so we stop this activity. That will not happen. It's like government agencies. I used to be the government official, so I know very well. You cannot just give up some of the budget or organizations in your government agencies, even if issue is less important than before. Either you change that budget item to more modern issues or emergency issues, or continue the old issue in some manner under different name. But anyway, the keeping the organization and keeping the budget oftentimes become the objective of any big organizations.
I wanted to also ask, and you've touched on this several times, so I hope I'm not asking you to repeat yourself too much, but what are the main reasons, or what is the main reason why Japan withdrew from the International Whaling Commission in 2019?
The reason we withdrew from that organization is the adoption of a commercial whaling moratorium happened in 82. And because of that, Japan's commercial whaling activities was ceased or suspended. The moratorium actually means interim suspension of whaling activities originally. So in order to resume the whaling activities in Japanese waters as well as Antarctic oceans, we try to meet the conditions of introduction of a moratorium, which is a lack of a scientific data or scientific uncertainty. And the scientific committee of IWC developed a system which takes into account the scientific uncertainties and give you a very conservative catch quota. And this was adopted in 1992 by the scientific committee and approved by consensus, interestingly, by the IWC Commission, which is a policy-making body, 2 years later in 1994. And we thought now we can go ahead with the whaling activities. But by approving this scientific achievement, which is very significant, the anti-whaling countries establish another conditions, which is enhancement of compliance and enforcement measures, which is in that sense reasonable and needed. But the discussion become more difficult as the whaling issue become that of a real conservation or management of activity to more of a protection of a charismatic animal. A lot of anti-whaling countries used a very impossible argument for the enforcement. But we resolve that one by one. For example, now, in order to prevent any smuggling and illegal catch, the 100% of Norwegian, Icelandic, and Japanese caught whales are analyzed with its DNA fingerprint. And we have a database of all whales caught legally by those countries. So you can, if you go to the market in Japan or Norway, Iceland, and get a piece of a whale meat and submit that for the DNA analysis, you can tell which animal was it. And it's not just species, you can name it. So you can name this particular animal in the individual basis. So this will at least make any illegal hunting or illegal marketing of whale meat very difficult. And also we have a satellite technology to monitor the movement of whaling vessels. Again, catching that big animal totally hiding from any observations is very challenging. You have to have a vessel, big enough vessel, and you have to land animal somewhere in the coast. And eventually you have to sell that meat or product to the market. So we resolve those issues one by one over 10 years, maybe more. And we counted at least 50 meetings to achieve those things. And this whole system is called Revised Management Scheme, RMS. And it's almost complete. And then some of the, especially the strong anti-whaling position countries said, the completion of our RMS does not mean we accept whaling activities. Because they said our general public opinion is totally anti-whaling. So we will not say yes, even if science is there, even if enforcement and compliance is there, still we are against. It's a goalpost moving. So at the beginning, we thought the science will resolve the issue. Then we thought the strengthened enforcement and compliance measures will solve the issue. It didn't. It became clear that the difference of positions, the opinions, the perceptions about whales and whaling is a basic problem we are facing in this organization. But we tried to have 3 different series of peacemaking negotiations. and all failed, unfortunately. And like any international negotiations where controversial issue is debated, you try to find some middle ground. The middle ground could be 50-50 or 60-70, but some place that both sides, if it's only two sides, equally dissatisfied or equally satisfied. But in case of whaling, one side denies whaling activities 100%. So any compromise finding negotiation is almost destined to fail. As a last resort, Japan proposed, okay, we have a difference of opinion, but the international community has actually the need for managing and conserving whales and whaling activities because there are activities happening and looks like it would not disappear so quickly. But there are public opinions in anti-whaling countries that deny the whaling totally. So can we have some compromise coexistence scheme in the International Whaling Commission so that we can ignore each other, if you like, but will not also disturb each other so that we can keep this organization and also we can keep the international framework, potential framework for the conservation and management of whales. And this proposal was also denied. So we have been engaged in almost 30 years or more than 30 years of hundreds of meetings and did everything starting from science, enforcement measures, compliance, and the peacemaking negotiations and a lot of compromise. Didn't work. And that's when Japan finally decided to withdraw from this organization, unfortunately. Doesn't mean we will conduct whaling unregulated or in a free manner. We decide catch limits of only abundant species within Japanese 200-mile zone based on that scientific methodology approved by IWC to calculate catch limits. And if you monitor Japanese media, you can find out argument from whalers that their catch limit is now even smaller than before as a result of withdrawing from IWC because we stopped scientific whaling activities in Antarctic. So we didn't expand whaling activities, but we are now conducting commercial whaling activities under and subject to the management and control and enforcement by the Japanese government.
I think a good question to ask now would be related to scientific whaling. And there has been a lot of criticism, I think, over the decades that with the idea that the scientific whaling is really used as an excuse to catch whales for commercial purposes because that meat is all it's all used for commercial purposes as well, right? So I'm curious. I'm sure this is an argument that you've had to make a thousand times, but I'm actually not sure of what the justification is or what the defense is against that accusation that scientific whaling is purely a front or has been in the past purely a front for commercial whaling.
Yeah. Scientific whaling or catching whales for the purpose of science has already been stopped by Japan when we withdrew from our International Whaling Commission. However, I'm happy to answer those questions. First of all, the utilization of whale meat after the scientific measurements and taking samples is actually in accordance with the convention which established the International Whaling Commission. And it says you have to process and utilize the carcass of animals after science as much as possible, and the proceeds you might get out of the selling of meat needs to be utilized under the direction of the parties to this convention. And this is a legal obligation. It starts as a shall. The parties shall. So if you just waste all the meat after the scientific measurements and sampling, that's against the convention. So utilization itself has no problem. And interestingly, this was accepted by International Court of Justice, ICJ, when Australia brought Japan to the lawsuits in the ICJ, which started from 2010 and gave the final judgment in March of 2014. And they accepted, but selling the whale meat does not constitute any illegal activities. It's more of an obligation. But as you may know, the ICJ judgment said that Japan's scientific whaling activities in Antarctic is a scientific activity, but not for the scientific purpose. That's what they said. And as a result, they ordered Japan to stop the scientific whaling activity at that time. There are several reasons that ICJ wrote in their final judgment. One is a number of scientific publication is small as compared to the scientific activities conducted. Our against argument was, the scientific whaling activities was not conducted for the purpose of publishing the peer-reviewed scientific paper. It was conducted so that you can provide scientific data to the Scientific Committee of International Whaling Commission to provide the basis for the resumption of sustainable whaling. So all the papers, which is hundreds of papers, were submitted as a contributing paper from the Japanese government to the scientific committee. So which is different from submitting your manuscript to the scientific journal for the peer-reviewed publication. So the ICJ did not regard those contributions to the scientific achievements, which we are not satisfied, but that was what they decided.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So Japan's motivation for that was explicitly because of the future plan to resume commercial whaling and to inform the sustainability of that practice, right?
Yes. And the moratorium, which was adopted in 1982, is oftentimes regarded the total prohibition or even the total permanent prohibition of commercial whaling. Actual legal language is very different from general understanding or impression. The language essentially says that we have to suspend commercial whaling activities for the time being, and at the latest by 1990, so 8 years from the adoption of a moratorium, based on the most recent available scientific data, they will consider the other catch limits. Other means other than zero catch limits. That's the language of so-called moratorium. So in a sense, this is a stipulation of ways how to resume commercial whaling activities. So the comprehensive reassessment of a past scientific evidence with the current most recent data and consider establishing a non-zero catch quota. So that's a requirement, and that's the reason that Japan built the scientific research activities to provide the scientific data for this purpose.
I see. Very occasionally, I see whale meat sold at restaurants or markets of some kind, but it's not particularly popular. It's clearly not the cultural practice that it once was to eat whale meat. So why is it worthwhile all the trouble for Japan to continue
Yeah.
whaling? I mean, all of the political arguments would go away if Japan stopped whaling. So why is it so important to continue?
Yeah, this is another interesting discussion. There's many points I can raise. For example, when we talked about the culture, does that mean that that's activity accepted and conducted by at least a huge number of people in your population? Is that culture? How about wearing Japanese kimono?
Very small number of people do it regularly, right?
Right. How about seeing no dancing? Do you go there every day? But they are established Japanese culture in many sense. So the number is not exactly the criteria to decide whether it's culture or not. It's more of a historical background as well as a specific feature of that activity as compared to other widespread activities, or are they significant in the many different way, culture, archaeology, and all those stuff. So making argument that only small number of people eat whale meat rarely does not support the idea this is a culture or not. But oftentimes people just accept without thinking that you don't eat whale meat, so it's not Japanese culture. Are you representing all the Japanese culture? In some places in Japan, for example, if you are living in Kanto area, eastern part of Japan, or Tokyo metropolitan area, you don't see whale meat so often. But when you move to western part of Japan, Kyushu, even Osaka, it's more widely consumed still.
And there are specific towns as well, right? Where
Yes,
within that town or even that prefecture, it's a
yeah.
much bigger thing.
Taiji is most famous one in Wakayama Prefecture. In one time, I think 50s and 60s, it's a long time ago, sometimes the western part of Japan, more than half of animal protein intake was whale meat. So it was significant, but now, because the catch is limited by the scientifically established catch limit, and also the introduction of moratorium and all those factors, annual supply of whale meat now is like 4,000 metric tons per year. And the Japan's population is 125 million or so. So if you divide very simply 4,000 metric tons by 125 million, you will get like 40 grams of a whale meat per year per person. But per capita consumption of whale meat still is 10 times higher in Kyushu than Tokyo. So it's quite localized food stuff with different cultures, different way of cooking. It only spread or occupy a significant part of animal protein intake in Japan after World War II. But in some places like Taiji and the western part of Japan, they have hundreds or thousand years of eating whale meat. So for them, it's a significant part of their food culture. And whenever you face a situation that someone from outside blame your food culture as the barbaric or whatever language they use, you tend to become very protective. That's another human nature. So those who are analyzing whaling controversy also try to find out why Japanese or Japanese government is so keen or stubborn about whaling activities. One of factors they identified anti-whaling feeling. So when you interview people, oftentimes you hear the opinion that I don't eat whale meat, but I'm angry about anti-whaling movement or Americans. Sometimes they say, because they are eating beef, pork. What's the difference? Very simplistic argument, but this is very real feeling of many people.
Hmm. With regard to Aboriginal subsistence whaling, this happens in a few countries around the world, but those countries are not considered to be doing the same thing that Japan is doing.
Mm.
There are, as far as I understand, there are allocations or allowances to indigenous populations to harvest a certain number of whales. And I'm just interested and curious about why there is so much focus on country level, like what Japan, Iceland, and Norway are doing, and so much less focus on the sort of Aboriginal subsistence whaling, because the numbers are actually comparable as far as I understand.
Uh, Even before the establishment of IWC in the 40s, there was some special treatment of indigenous peoples of whaling activities. And the assumption is their lives are very hard and they are people with special situations, more hard situation than metropolitan population, for example. So they are depending on the whaling activities. So some kind of exception needs to be provided. And the treatment of indigenous population is sensitive issue and political issue in almost all countries. And it's politically correct to provide a special status to indigenous people. In Japan, for example, the salmon fishing is generally prohibited, especially in the river, but Ainu people are allowed to some extent to conduct activities. So it's in many countries. And now in the United States and Russia and Denmark, on behalf of Greenland, and one Caribbean nation, the St. Vincent and Grenadines, this indigenous whaling activities or aboriginal subsistence whaling is allowed by International Whaling Commission. And many anti-whaling non-government organizations, as well as government, their official position is they do support the aboriginal subsistence whaling, but not exactly actively. They only accept as sort of unavoidable activities. And even on the side of indigenous people, because they see the discussion of controversy surrounding commercial whaling, they try to be as invisible as possible in the discussion of IWC. And at one time, even US government prohibited their indigenous people to contact us, any discussion, because that will make them more visible and subject to attack. Why the commercial whaling activities are wrong as compared to indigenous whaling activities if both activities are controlled by sustainable mechanism of calculating catch limits, which is now the case. Commercial activities are oftentimes subject to impression that it's based on the greed. So it could be over-harvesting the animals, and they could cheat because it's a commercial profit-based activities, while indigenous activities are more genuine need. So the indigenous whaling is acceptable whaling activities or killing of animal, while commercial activities are something evil. So in the discussion of a revised management scheme, there were very meticulous attempt to try to reduce any monetary interactions in the whaling activity in order to be accepted. So anything that related to money is wrong. That's a perception. But we have to recognize that in order to conduct the indigenous whaling, you have to buy fuels, you have to buy explosive harpoon, and even in the United States, they are allowed to sell the handicrafts using the whalebone or baleen. Actually, they are very expensive ones, but they are not allowed to sell the meat. So you cannot draw a line. And in the modern society, almost any activities involve some money. So the distinction between ASW, Aboriginal subsistence whaling, and commercial activities are very ambiguous. But indigenous issue is politically sensitive issue.
I have not yet confirmed which of two possible episodes I'll be recording for next month, but the topic will most likely be either an exploration of the ecological footprint concept with well-known sustainability advocate Matthijs Valkenagel, or a philosophical look at environmentalism and whether it's on the right track, with previous guest Sharachandra Lele. These are both conversations I'm really looking forward to, and I hope you can join us for them.